author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's edition, we are looking at the ins and outs of Trump's reciprocal tariffs and the fire and fury on the world stage after J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth's visit to Europe. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, LibertyNation.com is the proud sponsor of this here show, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. You're on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we are joined by Liberty Nation's economics guru, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So the big topic for the week is, it's not necessarily the overseas stuff. It's not necessarily the executive orders. It's the tariffs that are happening. And you did a great piece on the page of LibertyNation.com. Terrifying or terrific. And as far as I'm aware, you're the first person to coin that in print, which I kind of love it. It's a great piece, very explanatory for somebody like me who's not an economist and doesn't entirely understand the tariff situation. And I think across America there is they call it a water cooler debate about tariffs that's pretty much divided. Some people think the tariffs that Donald Trump's imposing are a wonderful thing, and others think that essentially this is just going to cost the average consumer more in the long run. But I wanted to get, because you're a very data-driven guy and you read all the studies, you look at all the reports. Give us your view from 20,000 feet, 30,000 with inflation.
Well, it's very early to say what kind of effects tariffs will have, because remember, nothing has really got into effect yet except for the 10% added tariffs on Chinese goods. But when it comes to reciprocal tariffs, when it comes to the steel and aluminum tariffs, nothing has been enacted. Nothing that's really showing up in the data. You only have, as I wrote in my Swamponomics column recently, is that you're seeing early victories that the Trump administration can take credit for when it comes to tariffs, because now some steel companies are saying, okay, we're going to bolster demand. We're seeing bolster demand. We're going to increase jobs. The recent Federal Reserve's data of industrial production actually increased on the back of stronger U.S. demand for U.S. factory goods. But overall, it's hard to show what kind of long-term effects that these types of tariffs will have.
Yeah, it's quite a fundamental divide, and it seems that few people can be swayed from one side to the other on this. And just put my we did talk about this off camera earlier, Andrew, but Trump's announced the reciprocal tariffs. That just to spell things out, what that means is if Brazil charges an across the board 8% tariff to the US, then the US is an 8% tariff across the board on Brazil, and that works for every country. Now, in my I'm not an economist, as you know, and I don't understand these things with the same level that you do, which is why I love having you on the show, because it's very expositional for me. It's a very good learning experience. But
I'm getting so many compliments on the show today. I guess I'm very, very flattered.
Yeah, I mean, we'll edit out the compliments later. We're just doing this to make you feel good now, but when it goes out, I'm kidding. We won't. We might. But it seems to me that short of having zero tariffs around the world, everybody doing zero tariffs, the very next best thing is precise reciprocal tariffs, isn't it? Because that essentially levels out the playing field.
Well, that's what the administration and all the administration officials have been saying since day one, is that, especially Howard Lutnick, he's the Commerce Secretary, and he had a Senate confirmation hearing. He was Trump's top salesman during the campaign. He'd go on the media interviews and saying, yes, reciprocal tariffs is what's necessary to level the playing field because all these countries are taking advantage of the United States. Trump, during his powwow with the reporters in the Oval Office, he was giving an example of India and how if the United States were to try to sell Harley-Davidson motorcycles to India, then India would slap 100% tariff on those motorcycles. Even on minuscule examples, the European Union, for example, the European Union, they have 10.5% tariffs on U.S. automobile imports. On the other hand, U.S. slaps about 2.5% tariff on European cars entering the country. The White House says, look, that's not fair. That's hurting the United States companies who want to export goods to the rest of the world. So why should we be paying higher tariffs, and we have such a low tariffs. Because if you look at the aggregate, I think it's the World Trade Organization data or World Bank, one of the two. They have a list of all of the average weighted tariff rates, and the U.S. is pretty low on that list. I think the average rate is about 2 to 4%. But you look at a country like India, the average rate is about 11.5%. Look at Brazil, about 9%. So on the aggregate level, a lot of countries have such high tariff rates on U.S. goods entering their countries.
So Donald Trump is right in a way. The U.S. is being ripped off by these tariffs.
I'm not going to delve too much into that.
Sure.
Because that's pretty. It's subjective whether the United States is being ripped off or not when it comes to, because look, the United States is the world's largest economy. Sure. It has a strong dollar. The U.S. has such strong purchasing power on the world stage. Forget the macro and microeconomics of it. But the world stage, the U.S. has just a strong purchasing power. It can buy all these goods from the rest of the world at such a low cost. I mean, even you look at the export United States export data. The U.S. even exports deflation to the rest of the world. Because last month's number showed a 0.2% increase, but import prices were up more than 1%. That's a different discussion, maybe.
That's a story for another time, children. So let's dig a bit deeper on understanding what these tariffs are and how they work. So and I will come into another great article that you wrote on Liberty Nation, which was what is the Sovereign Wealth Fund and how it works that Trump's proposing. And so let's use the example that you did with European cars. So there's a 10% tariff roughly 10% tariff of cars going into the Eurozone area. So if a car costs, just for example, $100,000, then it's $110,000 going in. Where does that $10,000 go? That goes to the government, right?
Yeah. So the company that imports that product, they pay the tariff, and that goes to the government. So okay. So let's look at the United States. So the U.S. importers, when they pay these tariff rates, they generate about $80 billion a year for the United States, just because based on that low tariff. So if you look at long-term forecasts, if those tariffs are implemented, the United States could collect about at least $1 trillion over the next 10 years. Some estimates are even more liberal, saying about $3 trillion.
Okay, so essentially these tariffs are putting money into government coffers.
Yes.
To spend as they wish. And at the moment, with almost every country, the US is paying money into almost every other country's coffers at a greater rate than it's receiving money from these countries. And that's where the imbalance comes from, right? That's the trade imbalance.
Well, you're talking about a trade deficit. Now, there's so much bells and whistles about the trade deficit. Jameson Greer, he's the U.S. Trade Representative, and he was on Capitol Hill and during his confirmation hearing, and he was saying how the trade deficit is a grave threat to the United States. But the trade deficit, just basic economics, trade deficit, everyone has a trade deficit. I go to the supermarket and I buy goods. I have a huge trade deficit with the supermarket because that supermarket is not buying goods for me. I'm buying goods primarily from that supermarket. So I think there's a lot of hoopla. What's the phrase that people say? But anyway, there's a lot of
Al Pacino would pronounce it hoo-ha.
Fine. There's a lot of hoo-ha for the trade deficit. Trade deficit is also something that bothers me so much. I mean, President Trump, he's in the White House and he always says how the United States is subsidizing Canada to the tune of $200 billion because of the trade deficit. Although that number is exaggerated. The number is more about $50 billion a year in the trade deficit. But that's only because United States importers are importing more oil from Canada. That's why there's a trade deficit. But it's not that the taxpayers are subsidizing another country. That's not the case. It's just that it's just exchange of goods and services. Now, you can go in a broader discussion that perhaps, okay, maybe tariffs can play a role why countries are importing or exporting more or less, or, the value-added taxes are exacerbating conditions, whatever the case. But trade deficit is not U.S. taxpayer resources going to another country.
We're going to continue this conversation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Andrew back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's economics editor, Andrew Moran. So, Andrew, we've been talking about tariffs in the first segment there. And I want to continue with that for a little while if we could. So, Donald Trump has reports being made up by his people to determine what kind of, I guess, balance sheet impacts will happen, and that's due on April 1st. What do we expect to see in that?
Okay, so there's a few different reports that are being produced by the Commerce, by Treasury, by the U.S. Trade Representative, and a couple of other administration officials. And the one report is talking about the fiscal impact of tariffs, how much revenue would they generate. Another report is a pretty comprehensive overview of U.S. trade relationships with the rest of the world. They determine, what the tariff rates are, what the trade deficit is, what levies, what goods and services are being exchanged at an imbalance or balanced rate, perhaps. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to April Fool's Day to look at these numbers, because it will determine whether the United States is a fool or if it's on the level.
Yeah, well, what's the opposite of that, right? A savvy pricer, a savvy pricer. So let's if we consider that the tariffs that obviously they've been held back, many of them, except as you point out the China one. How is the rest of the world reacting to the coming imposition of these tariffs? What are they doing to shore up either their government coffer supplies or to protect consumers, which I'm actually not sure they are doing anything. They are not planning anything to protect consumers directly, because that would just it involves some massive central planning things. Well, what's happening?
Well, I would say, first of all, on protecting consumers, there's not much really you can do.
Yeah.
A lot of economists I speak to, they always say, there's divided by saying, okay, yeah, tariffs are inflationary and they're going to raise the aggregate inflation level by about 0.8 percentage points. Others say, tariffs are not inflationary, or if they're a one-time price increase. But anyway, so now how the rest of the world is responding, Canada, they're up in arms, especially when it comes to steel aluminum tariffs, because they're the number one exporter to the United States when it comes to steel. 60% of U.S. imports of steel come from Canada, with I think Quebec about 60% of that overall figure. Europe is up in arms. What's her name? Your Ursula von der Leyen. She was saying, okay, we're gonna have countermeasures. We're gonna retaliate. China, who's just always complaining about any reciprocal tariffs.
Sorry to interrupt there. When Ursula von der Leyen, she's the president, one of the many presidents that they have in the European Union. When she says we're going to retaliate, how? That's my question. So if we're looking at President Trump is going to put reciprocal tariffs, so it's a dollar for dollar reciprocity. When she says we're going to retaliate, what by upping the tariffs? Then I don't understand how the retaliation come in.
Okay, so I think that her first response had to do more of the steel and aluminum tariffs,
right,
the 25%. I think when it comes to reciprocal tariffs, her beef is going to be mostly about the value-added tax, because there's so much disagreement about the VAT, of how it's not necessarily a tariff and everyone has to pay it, whether you're a European or American automobile manufacturer. And so the administration, they think that value-added taxes triple tariff rates in Europe, which they deem, of course, not fair. So if they were, let's say, raise tariffs to 30%, then European Union is going to say, okay, well, that's not right. So we're going to start raising everything now to 30%, whatever the case. So so that thing, when it comes to Europe specifically, that's the most impacted region, I think, for these reciprocal tariffs, mainly due to the value-added taxes.
So let's talk about value-added tax, VAT. It's all my life I've grown up hearing, hey, but you got to add the VAT onto that. And it's the most, I've always seen it, and I might be wrong on this, but I've always seen and felt it viscerally that it's the most pernicious of all taxes, because, it was, and I'm not sure that the current situation, but it was that, well, it's only on like high value items that you don't need. That was the point of the value-added tax. It was on things that you don't necessarily have to survive. But that seems to have gone by the wayside, and now it's just an extra tax.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I was looking at some of the numbers when I was composing my article, and I saw that case. So first, the value-added tax represents about 18% of European GDP. Yeah. And then the next number is that the value-added tax is about 20% of revenue for European countries. So I think I may be wrong, because I don't have any experience in value-added taxes, but it seems as if one of those regressive things whereby, okay, it's going to start impacting first luxury goods, and then over time to collect more revenues for these revenue-starved governments, they started transferring it to absolutely everything under the sun. Am I correct in that supposition?
Yes, that's exactly right. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his government have decided to apply VAT to private school fees. Now, many people might say, why on earth do you need to send your children to private schools? Well, let me tell you, the public school system, you don't want to go there. But here's the thing. What's happening is they've created this impression that the only people who go to private schools are the children of the uber wealthy. Yeah. They haven't taken into consideration that these are families that it's difficult to make ends meet to pay the school fees that they do. With an extra 20%, what they're finding is that they're going to need an extra 40,000 school places in the UK because people can't afford to pay an extra 20% on top of what they're already paying. And so it's created this massive crisis of there aren't places to send kids to school, which, my personal opinion, I think this is a good thing. You know, get with the homeschooling programs, right? When you see this VAT being expanded, as you say, to everything because it's a great revenue builder for the government, that's far more damaging to the individual consumer than reciprocal tariffs would be.
I think we've got off onto a completely different topic. I was thinking on the issue of tariffs and the value-added taxes. There's some disagreement among economists of whether it really impacts trade between, let's say, just Europe and the United States. Because there's one report by the Tax Foundation, Erica York, she's a senior economist there, a couple of other economists, and they say that value-added taxes, it's trade neutral, whereby if the United States ships it, let's say it ships a Ford car to Europe, or Germany builds a BMW, they're both going to pay the exact same value-added taxes. There's no benefit, there's no advantage that Europe is getting over the United States based on the value-added taxes. But the administration ostensibly disagrees. As I said earlier, they think it raises tariffs to as much as 30% because the average VAT in Europe is 21.8%. You got the 10% on top of that for the tariffs. I think that really hurts the United States on the trade front.
Well, so in the US they have an added sales tax, which is between 3 and 11%. Is that?
Yeah. So that's the thing. They say the Tax Foundation economists, they say that actually the sales tax is far more harmful to trade than the value added taxes because Howard Lutnick, he says that that's our export subsidies for Europe, and that's how they get the benefit for it. But the sales tax, it's hard to you don't get a rebate for it. So if you ship a car to the United States, some car dealer buys it, they have to pay that sales tax in the state regardless of that. But in Europe, ostensibly, they have rebates for it. And therefore, also, the other argument made by the Tax Foundation is that the country that imports the good with the value-added tax, their currency appreciates more. Therefore, it's easier to purchase the exports of U.S. goods. But on overall, if you look at the European exchange rate to the U.S. dollar, it's hard to see that in real time. But that's the crux of the discussion.
Andrew, thanks for the education. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're joined today by Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, Dave Patterson. Thanks for coming in, Dave.
Happy to be with you, Mark, always.
So, Dave, it seems to me that things are really heating up over on the Ukraine-Russia borders and the situations there, especially with Pete Hegseth, National Security Secretary, Defense Secretary, and J.D. Vance going to the Munich Security Conference and laying out some incredibly, I don't think they're that stringent on a personal level, but what a lot of the world's media say are some very stringent demands for how to negotiate a peace settlement. What were the big highlights out of these recent visits for you?
Well, I think the first is that when Secretary Hegseth basically and unapologetically just laid it out, and he started to elaborate on what I refer to as the Trump Doctrine, And effectively, what that is it's a dose of reality. I mean, it's not like it's on the margin or something that seems unrealistic. It is the most realistic, actually, when you look at the United States and the problems that the United States has. And I see it as kind of threefold. First of all, the United States is going to be more involved with its own threats. And obviously, he laid it out. It was our southern border and China. And secondly, it's going to be more engaged with its neighbors to the south and north because they're the most immediate transactional partners. And lastly, the United States is going to be a complementary force to Europe, not a guiding or not a burden holding force. And so it's going to be complementary yet still supportive because we have equities and Europe has equities in the United States, and you just can't deny that. But there's a logic behind this, and that if Europe becomes stronger, and stronger when I mean that they're picking up more of their defense, more of the intellectual burden of where they are and what they have to do in order to be successful in a world where you have Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, which I don't think Europe fully appreciates. But as they become stronger, then the partnership with the United States becomes more equitable. And so the United States will have to and needs to have to depend on Europe in thwarting and being a bulwark against China. And they can't do it with a weakened Europe.
So a couple of things I want to pick up on that, Dave, is you say that about how the US will be more of a complementary source of guidance rather than not a free source of guidance, complementary as in addition to source of guidance rather than bringing things together and leading a coalition of nations. Now, there was this idea that under Joe Biden, American leadership was back. And as far as I can tell, that was an utter falsity put forward, maybe even perhaps to Joe Biden himself, with the weaselly words of the European internationalists or globalists saying, "Oh, look, we've got this great leader in Joe Biden." But really, what they wanted was somebody that they could push around, do what they want, but who would foot the bill without question. What do you make of that, by the way? Do you think I've got that pretty much right?
I think you're right. I think you're right to an extent. But at the same time, I have to bring up the fact that Joe Biden was not the leader.
Sure, that's my point. Yeah.
Jens Stoltenberg was the leader. Jens Stoltenberg brought Europe together to face Ukraine, not Joe Biden. And it was a mythology that, to your point, that the European leaders kind of watered and nurtured, that he was somehow leading this band. I don't think that was ever true.
Yeah, Jens Stoltenberg, the leader, I've forgotten his title. Is he the General Secretary? You know, regardless of what you think of the organization, he was a firm leader with a clear direction in what he wanted the group to achieve.
That's right. And not only that, but he understood the emerging problem for Europe with the Indo-Pacific. Remember, he took a very important trip out to South Korea. And so he got it. Interestingly enough, Rutte also has come around and said, yeah, we're going to have to spend more because I think, what you think is where you are. And in this position, I think he can see easily that it's not working, that you have, I know the Europeans hate this, but old Europe has lagged behind new Europe. You have the Baltics and the accessions of the former Soviet Union And they're far more enthusiastic because they know what the consequences are and have lived under them. And so they're working very diligently. Poland, of course, is the star here. And
Yeah. Poland, Hungary, I've forgotten what they're called together. The Visegrad group.
yeah,
Visegrad
right.
nations. And yeah, they really do seem to have a clear understanding of what terror lies in the coming direction, because for them it's their past, and it's not as though it's their past 100 years ago. It's their past in my lifetime. It's you travel around these areas and
Yeah, it's
see
34 years ago.
yeah, you see the concrete monstrosities that was essentially what they thought of as at the time, the leaders of the thought of as, this is how people are. We can put them in the little boxes made of ticky-tacky, concrete ticky-tacky. And it's an ugliness, but it's a reminder as well that life under these regimes is ugly and brutal. I'm going to play you a very short clip, Dave, of Secretary Hegseth and his message to the partners in Europe.
Well, I will state definitively, as I did in Brussels, that America is committed to the NATO alliance. Our message has been, and as we discussed, we believe heard loud and clear, that member countries in NATO need to spend more, need to invest more, need to have more skin in the game for their collective defense. That is not just a suggestion from the United States of America. That is a direct request, which we will follow up on as a reflection of their desire and commitment to actually defend their own backyard. That's a serious aspect of NATO becoming a serious alliance in the future.
What do you make of that, Dave?
Well, going a little bit further in what he said, I mean, he just told the truth. I mean, there are things that there are mythologies that the United States and Europe have fed into, and one of them is that if we just give Ukraine enough materials, war materials, arms, ammunition, they will be able to drive the Russians out. That is patently false. That is not going to happen, and it's a fool's errand to suggest that it will. And yet Biden to the end held on to as long as it takes, but what he didn't say, as much as it takes. And the American taxpayer simply will not brook the second part of that. But the Europeans believe that as well. And that's what's troubling, is that you had these enablers gathering, and they all bought into the same mythology. And when President Barack Obama failed to do anything in April of 2014, and Russia annexed Crimea, the Donetsk region, and the Luhansk region, the die was cast. And to suggest that Russia is going to leave these is ridiculous, and they're not.
Well, we're going to discuss what an actual peace deal looks like in reality after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. We're continuing our conversation with Dave Patterson, Liberty Nation's national security correspondent. Earlier we were talking about the mythology that surrounds the United States and its position in European peacekeeping. But I want to move on to what we just touched on, which is, what does a peace deal look like in Ukraine? And you mentioned that there's no way that Russia will go back to pre-2014 when it annexed Crimea. That's not going to happen. And I think in reality, Dave, any territory that Russia holds today, that will have to be the starting point of any peace deal, whether Ukraine likes it, whether European allies like it or not. Because I don't see why Russia, Vladimir Putin, would give back the territory that they've seized so far. I don't think there's anything. Am I missing something? Is there something that can impel Russia to give back that land that they've taken?
I think you're right. I think that they might give up some of the land, which would be too expensive to renovate after.
Sure.
I mean, that's just pure rubble. And there's that possibility. But more importantly, President Trump sees this as a much broader transaction. This is not just Ukraine and giving back or holding or whether there'll be troops there. I think President Trump sees this as a much more global issue in that he has at his disposal, we find now, many more sticks in sanctions and could, in fact, with the United States liquid natural gas capability, totally take Russia, totally is too strong a term, but take Russia out of that market and make it very difficult for them, as well as looking at Iran and explaining to Iran that there are going to be no more drones, one more drone, and Esfahan is a goner. And these are the kinds of things that I think Trump sees. I mean, I'm going to talk about for him because, but it appears to me that this is where his head is. And I think that's how you go into these negotiations. You can't narrow them down so that you only have two options or one option in order to negotiate. It has to be a much broader negotiating table with a lot more issues on it there's give and take.
Yeah, no Hobson's choice, I think. It's offering the Hobson's choice. You're not really offering anything at all. Now, there's a lot of noise in my neck of the woods in the UK, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and he's talking about sending British troops to Ukraine this is presumably after a peace deal has been reached, as a peacekeeping force.
I think, quite frankly, that it can't be just British soldiers. It has to be as Hegseth, recommended, that it has to be a multinational force. It has to be non-NATO, and it cannot come under the Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. And so I think that if you think about this in terms of just British troops, well, I think that many of your points are exactly spot on. But on the other hand, if you think about it in terms of a broader and more diverse, if that's the good word, group of troops, I think that because what it does is it spreads the equities, and so that now if Russia would do anything untoward, then they have a problem with not just the UK, but a number of other countries. I think that you would get, certainly Poland would provide troops. I think that the Baltics would, and France and Germany, that's a tough one. I'm never sure that they're actually in the world.
Well, France, President Emmanuel Macron, he recently invited European leaders to a summit to discuss a response to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And how did that go?
How would you expect it to go? Everybody has a different idea. And I don't think from what I can understand, there was no uniform view coming out. But their purpose was not necessarily to come up with any sort of grand solutions. Their purpose was to say, oh dear, what's going to happen to us? We're being cut out of these discussions. That was the purpose of the meeting. And the fact is that, and this may sound kind of internationally hubris, but does Trump and Zelensky and Russia really need to have representatives from other European nations kibitzing or interfering or offering suggestions during these negotiations? I doubt it. And I think that Trump sees it as a distraction more than a help.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about how President Trump's spoken with Vladimir Putin and then spoke with Vladimir Zelensky. And it does seem that for the last 3 years of war, nobody's really made an effort to try and find out what each side wants. There's I believe the sociologist Rogers, I can't remember his name. It's not Mr. Rogers, although Carl Rogers, that's it. And there's the Rogerian method of conflict resolution that is widely adopted by the UN and essentially most organizations that seek to temper violence between nations. And the principle behind that being, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that you find out, you have one side state clearly what it wants, and then you have the other side put back what they've heard, and that way
parrot back.
Yeah, to parrot back what they've heard, and then they do the same in reciprocation. So each side fully understands precisely what each side wants, and that hasn't happened in the last 3 years. A final question for you, Dave: why hasn't it happened?
So what I hear you saying is, why hasn't this Rogerian methodology? It was part of his psychology and psychiatric practice, actually. Why hasn't that worked? And it's simple. It's not a negotiation. It's simply a trust building opportunity, but it's not a negotiation. If I tell you what I really want, oh my gosh, you would now have the advantage. Why would I continue? Now I know what you want, and you know what I want, and so that we're at loggerheads, and it's to kind of give you some background. I actually have my degree is in counseling psychology. And one of my internships was at the California Medical Facility outside of Vacaville, which is a prison. And you would have Juan Corona, the serial killer. You had a variety of very famous criminals, and try that with them. So let me hear what you really want. Well, I want out. Well, okay, got it. But I think that it's somewhat a far field, but nonetheless, the idea is the Rogerian approach to things. And I think that you're exactly right about the way in which the Biden administration would go about these things, which was very similar. But I craft their ideas a little bit differently. And if I'm real nice to you, will you be real nice to me? And of course, we know how that's worked out. And the Trump approach is not like that at all. I mean, when Hegseth said it is unrealistic that Ukraine will become part of NATO. Oh my goodness! People back in the United States said, "Oh my gosh, he's giving away the negotiating position." And no, it's a different dynamic. So I put that out there, and you say something that I don't like, and I take it away. Okay, no, tomorrow they're going to be part of NATO. I'm sorry, we're not going down that road. I offered you something. It was an olive branch, and you dismissed it and rejected it, but now it's back on the table. And so it's a little bit different, and it's certainly proven effective for Donald Trump in the past. So I don't bet against him.
Wise words. Dave Patterson, thanks ever so much for joining us.
You bet. Happy to be with you, Mark, always.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, Andrew Moran and Dave Patterson, and of course you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to join us. Please do remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.